Thank you. Is that Doug?
Yes, I can't get my camera to work. I'm sorry.
Well, we can hear you. That's beautiful, sir.
Okay, I'm afraid to go out. I'm afraid to lose it altogether.
All right, good. So when we begin chapter 5, you see the specifications for high priest. The brilliance of this writer, it just overwhelms me. What he knows of the Old Testament. I probably have learned so much. I had several good teachers, but I don't think I've ever had a teacher that's been so effective as the writer of Hebrews. Years ago, I wanted to follow the trail of an interpreter, how he interpreted a text. Well, I've learned that as well from the writer of Hebrews as from anyone. So now, when you come to chapter 5, what chapter of the Old Testament must you put right at the heading? Just take a pen and paper and a pencil and mark over chapter 5. The first verse, you put Leviticus 1, chapter 8. So it's absolutely imperative that you lock. And God has been so kind. I can't believe the data that he puts in, that's put into my mind, it locks there. But like Leviticus chapter 8. And so in Leviticus chapter 8, you have to have that data. Now, remember, we're talking about how do you interpret one of our lessons. And this idea expressed in words is, you've got to know what the writer knew before he wrote the text. So as close as we can figure out what was in the mind of the writer, the better we will be at understanding what he wrote. So the question is, did the writer know anything about the priest of the Old Testament? And the answer is yes.
Yes.
And how do you know where he knew? Well, you see his reference that Aaron was appointed high priest. Well, you've got to know that's Leviticus chapter 8. So what does that mean as a student? It means for Bob Long, I sit here with my computer and I've blown the text up about 4 or 5 times so I can see it. And then I say, okay, go to Leviticus chapter 8. And so when I go to Leviticus chapter 8, and then I read where God has instructed Moses to take his older brother, and I even looked up, you know how much older Aaron was to Moses? He was 4 years old when Moses was put in the water in the basket of reeds, and he was put there, and his sister was there, Miriam, she's older, and Aaron was 4 at the time when Moses is floating around in the water. So now at this time, how old is Moses? Well, he was 40 years in preparation being a pharaoh. Now he's been in the back desert for 40 years. So that makes him what? 80 years. So he's not a boy anymore. You know, I'm 81, and this guy, his sight hasn't even failed yet when he makes 120. And I've got one eye, my left eye is gone because of a BB injury, and the right eye still lets me get around, right? Nervously for my friends who ride with me when I'm driving. But so here's Moses, 80, physically strong, out taking care of sheep, you know. And so God has called him, and he's responded. He's gone back to Egypt, where he was a wanted man, and all those that sought him to kill him were already gone. So he's back there. And so it's just phenomenal. He appoints Aaron at the command of God when he's 80 years of age, you know, to be a high priest. And now you need to read more than just the appointment of him. You need to also read further. You want to go to Numbers 14 through 17 at least. And you'll learn that, I think it's Numbers 17, you have 250 cousins who are Levites. And when they come to Moses, the leader comes to Moses So it's Moses' cousin. All of them are Levites. And he says, what is this? You have taken the priesthood to your family, Moses, and we are Levites. We are all equally before God. So what is the advantage? And so there's a rebellion that's going to occur. So 250 cousins come with their censers, and they stand before, at the instructions of God, they've got their censers producing incense, and they're made out of brass, and they stand before the tent, and in rebellion, what happens to those 250 men? Moses says to Aaron to tell his friends, his son, take the charred remains. Lightning came from heaven and burned up 250 men, and their charred bones were taken away, and the censers were collected. Now, so that Israel would never forget the rebellion against God and the rejection of the high priest, what happened to those censers? At the instruction of God, Moses took them and he beat them into a solid piece. And where does he put that brass? Over the altar, the mercy seat. So every year, there's a perpetual reminder to God that his high priest was rejected, his selection. Now, typologically, what happens with Christ? As Aaron was rejected, so is Christ rejected.
Jesus.
See, so is Jesus rejected. So you'll see that, and then to further confirm that Aaron is selected as high priest, is that the rebellion goes on. Dathan is, remember, the earthquake is going to open up, swallow man, woman, beast, animals, children, babies, pregnant women, and take them down in an earthquake and cover them up. Well, shortly after that, then the Israelites, they get their courage and come back, and they accuse Moses and Aaron of going to take them out in the wilderness and kill them. Well, there's still one more selection of the high priest. So then you take a twig off of a almond tree, take your knife, cut it, and everybody puts their name on it. So each leader, each one from each one of the tribes, and Levi representing, Aaron representing the tribe of Levi, and they all bring in 12 of their twigs, and you can easily identify them. Everybody sees them, and they're put into the tent of meeting. And the next morning, when Moses goes in, he picks up Aaron's, and what's the uniqueness of Aaron's?
Sprouted.
Not only sprouted, but what? Produced almonds overnight. How do you take, a sapling, cut it off? I don't know if you've ever done any grafting. I mean, I haven't. I've seen it done, but it doesn't grow overnight. And so this rod budded overnight. Now, interesting, when I used to hear people teach the tabernacle, they never told me the meaning of the mercy seat, that reminds God of the sinfulness of Israel. They never told me that the Aaron's rod that budded, that it was a reminder of rebellion. They never told me that the cup of manna was a reminder of sinfulness. So if you need proof of the sinfulness of Israel, just teach the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant. And, so you get the massive rebellion. And then what's so wonderful is that, that could picture us. We could all be that ark. The contents of it is that once a year, and again, I went back and did some more research. Please be careful. The only sins that were forgiven on that Day of Atonement are unintentional sins. And I didn't know that all through my youth. The only sins that are forgiven are unintentional. So you go over to Numbers 15 and you learn intentional versus unintentional sins. Now, why do I say that only unintentional sins? Well, when you read Numbers 15 and you see intentional sins, what do they do with the person who commits sins intentionally? They put him to death. Now, you have case law there. In America, our legislation passes a law. And now the Department of Justice has to interpret. So there's usually a case, and the judge will be cited a case number saying, sir, case number of so and so and so and so and so. This is what the conclusion was. The law said this. Well, in Numbers 15, you have a man picking up sticks on the Sabbath. And they don't know what to do with him, so they arrest him. And what do they do with him? You know the story, right?
Yeah.
Put him to death. You see, that's intentional sin. Now take the case of David. Is David's sin intentional? Was the lust intentional? Yes.
Yes.
Was the adultery intentional? Yes. Was the murder intentional? Yes. Well, so David can't go and ask for forgiveness. There is no transfer of intentional sins to the mercy seat. And that needs to be clarified, because people think the Church of Christ, when I was in Oklahoma, the Church of Christ believes that the Old Testament people are saved by means of the law, because there's no baptism there by their people. And so New Testament are only saved. And that's so wrong. See, we got to clarify that. So when we talk about Aaron, we need to make sure that we know the limitations of his ministry. His is only a typological ministry. So the guy never shows up there. Now, the problem is, in the congregation, there are men who have committed intentional sins. But their penalty, you'll see in Hebrews, their conscience still condemns them after the sacrifice. Why? Because the guilt was not removed. Now, in your case, my case, what do you do with your past sins and the guilt? My guilt is gone. I don't lug that heavy guilt. There's no backpack upon my back that I'm dragging up towards the cross. I've already been there. I know what happened to the penalty. So it's very important that we have an understanding of Aaron when you come to chapter 5. And if I had to place a bet, I would say that this writer is a Levitical priest, that he came from that camp. He's so schooled, millions of hours in the Old Testament, just phenomenal. So here's the point again. When you come to understanding Hebrews, if you don't spend the time knowing what the writer knew, minimum amount that he knew, then it'll be very difficult to follow. So you can see from Leviticus chapter 5, and since we're short on time, I'm going to just go a little bit more with you and to show this beauty of what's happening. So I've given you two illustrations. One, the illustration of Aaron being selected by God at the instructions given to Moses to make him high priest. And number two, I've showed you a rebellion of 250 cousins who wanted to be high priest, and they were rejected by God because God has a high priest. He has only one man he wanted to be high priest, and that was Aaron. Now, you learn later, what's the weakness of the Aaronic priesthood? They die. So you have succession. One priest follows what? Another. Eli followed his son, right? When Moses is told, take Aaron up on Mount Horeb and take the robes off of him and put them on his son, Aaron is not coming down. He's going to be buried. He's going to die outside the promised land. So succession is a weakness of this priest. So the priest, Aaron, is selected when he's alive. So the question is, did Jesus usurp the priesthood? Was he like one of these renegade Jews, these 250 men, that didn't accept the priesthood of Aaron? Now remember, the readers, many of them perhaps are Palestinian Jews, and they hold that high esteem Aaron. And then you see the priesthood, and they're having a difficulty in chapter 6. You'll see this. They can't go ahead. They're having to abandon so much of their personal belief, they can't make progress. And they're just stymied. They're slow. They've stalled. They're sitting there spinning their tires in the sand. They can't go anywhere. And because they can't give up the priesthood. So now the question is, how did Jesus get to be a priest? Did he usurp it? Did he, on his own will, go against God and eject Aaron as high priest? And you know how the answer is? It is so gorgeous. Now the answer comes through two Old Testament quotations. So when you see the beauty of these two quotations, one, Psalm 2:7. So this is proof. The writer of Hebrews is going to use Psalm 2:7 as proof that Jesus did not usurp the high priesthood. Well, you'll say, how in the world did he do that? And then he's going to use Psalm 110, verse 4, as the second proof. And then he's going to tell you a wonderful interpretation. So Psalm 2:7 is today, and this is where you have to go back if you don't know Psalm 2 and learn the four divisions of it. And then verse 7, the Messiah has been rejected in verse 3. At verse 4 to 6, he's been crowned king. In verse 7, you hear the message of the Son that the Father said to the Son in the back room. He said, today I have become your Father. Well, Acts 13:32 through 35, you learn that's the resurrection. So the writer of Hebrews quotes Psalm 2:7 as proof that Jesus was dead in the grave. Now listen, his eyelids won't move. Maybe his beard's still growing, Donnie.
Yeah.
You know, after he's dead in the grave, he's still growing, but his toes won't wiggle. He's wrapped in a mummy cloth. He's bound up. And then God the Father raises him from the dead. Now listen, a dead man can't steal. You know, I'd feel really safe, Donnie, to put my wife's jewels next to a dead corpse if you could lock the corpse in a room with no entry, you know, because the corpse won't steal. Jesus cannot, as a dead man, cannot usurp. God the Father has to what? Select him, raises him from the dead. For what purpose? To make him high priest. Now that's the first illustration. And he uses Psalm 2:7. And then, now this is where I remember, this was so many, I can't believe, as I look back over my life, so many moments where you learn something. What is the key requirement? There are more than one, but what is the key requirement that would qualify Jesus to be a Melchizedekian high priest? So if you go back to Psalm 110, only the second time where it's used, Melchizedek's used. So listen to the text. How does the text go?
The Lord has sworn, and he will not change his mind. You are a priest forever.
Right there.
In the order.
All right, right. Put your underline forever.
Yes.
Now, that's a contrast. How long was Aaron priest?
Short time.
Until he died, right?
Yes.
Now, when does this man become priest? After his death. Aaron was priest in his lifetime and ceases to be priest of his death. This man is dead and becomes a priest after his death. So resurrection is everything. Boy, we need to know this. Listen, the grave doesn't end it for us. You know, Chuck and I are towards the end of our lives. We hope we have more time, you know, but just we're towards the end. But Jesus after the end, became high priest. The requirement for being a high priest is twofold in Psalm 110. First of all, verse 1, you have to be a king. You have to be king of Judah. But he was dead. That's why Psalm 2:7 is quoted, is he makes him a king. Now, at verse 104, at 110, verse 4, he has to be able to live forever. So when Jesus conquers death and is raised from the dead, that is the preeminent requirement for the ability to be a Melchizedekan priest, to live forever. No
Yes.
Levitical priest can ever be a Melchizedekan priest because he can't live forever. But this one man from Judah is raised from the dead, and God makes him what?
Hey,
Forever.
You see that? Isn't that beautiful? Now, so now what we're proving is that God appointed Jesus. God is going to set aside the previous revelation. Leviticus 8 is set aside at the resurrection of Jesus Christ, when Psalm 2:7 is fulfilled, when Psalm 110 verse 4 is fulfilled. Previous revelation is set aside. My mother said to my sister, tell Bob to come home, take the trash out. That's previous revelation. Second sister came and said, Mama said, don't worry about coming home, take the trash out, because when you come home to school today, Daddy's going to beat your butt. You're in trouble. So I thought, well, I better go home. Previous revelation, was canceled by later revelation, and that's important. So Leviticus 8 is canceled by Psalm 2:7 and canceled by Psalm 110 verse 4.
four.
So you see that now. So what question are we answering? Did Jesus usurp the priesthood? Was he appointed? And then when you see the chart, you'll see yes, just like Aaron was appointed, Jesus was appointed, right? Just like Aaron represented the people, Jesus is going to what? Represent the people.
Represent the people.
Now, so here's where we come in, and you'll see in your, I think you all have it. It's this version of chapter 5. You see the twofold prayer. There's a prayer that comes from Mark. Father, if it's possible, do what? Take this cup from me. And you know the answer to that. It's what? Denied.
Accepted, not accepted.
Yeah, it's just not accepted, right? So now, good morning, Sukumar. And so then now that's prayer A. So you see there, you see a pitchfork. A is, you see A is the prayer, take this cup from me, and the answer denied. And then you see B, though, there's another prayer, and that's the prayer of Hebrews chapter 5. It's so wonderful there. You see that answer? In reverent submission, he takes that human will, and he's come to a place that you and I must come to. One day, I learned I lost a friend in Oklahoma 6 months ago. He fell, hit his head, and died. And his wife said, I never got a chance to say goodbye. It's so here, this one at 3:00 on Good Friday is brought to a point where everything's finished and he can say it is finished. And his last words are, into thy hands I commit my
Spirit.
Spirit.
Jay, you're a young preacher. Every preacher's preached the 7 last sayings of Christ. They take 7 sermons, 7 weeks, and sooner or later in their life, they all do this, the 7 sayings of Christ. But that last
Yes,
saying,
nice.
yeah, into thy hands I dismiss. Now, you think about that. A voluntarily trusting God the Father. Now, how much human can you get? When it comes to my last days, I don't know if I'll be conscious or unconscious when I die. But can you imagine being conscious? And you have to believe that God the Father can be trusted, that you can dismiss your human spirit from your human material body, and that human invisible spirit attached to your divine personhood of the Word is so experiencing humanity that you can say, I want to separate, it's time, separate my invisible human part from my visible part and die, trusting God the Father. Now, Dr. Crichton was in the hospital. I saw him the last he did his Friday morning at men's class. He was so weak, often Chuck Lumpy would pick him up after the Friday morning class. He had cancer, and would physically pick him up after everybody left and take him down to a lounge and put him on a couch. David used to do that for Crichton. And then after a while, he'd revive. And anyway, he was standing outside of his office, and I happened to be in Memphis passing through, and he stood with his left foot against the wall, leaning against it, his office outside, and talking to a gentleman as I came by. I called him, and now he's one of my mentors, and he's going to die that week. And I called him in the hospital, and I said, God has brought you to the same place that he brought Jesus Christ our Lord. Well, the theologian, you can just say, wait a minute now. Brought me to the same spot, Jesus? Well, the problem is that I was stronger in my view of the humanity of Christ than Crichton was. Is that he didn't know the separation of personhood from nature, so that there's no attributes in the personhood, so that the personhood can experience fully the onslaught of the weakness of that human nature. So yes, he has to exercise faith like you and like I. That's the point, is that Jesus trusted God, and you and I are going to be trusting God one day, that we're going to have to dismiss, we can't do that, but God will take our human spirit from our body, and we're going to be at a place, hopefully, of peaceful trust. Into thy hands I commit my spirit. So that humanity is so real. So when you come to chapter 5 again of Hebrews, in reverent submission. Now, who is this that dismisses his human material from the immaterial? It's the Creator, chapter 1. Don't ever forget, it's the Creator, but yet he is the heir, he's man. So, boy, your Christology is so crucial in interpreting the scripture. So now, and it says that his prayer is heard. So then you have to stop and say, wait a minute, do you remember having to interpret this passage first time? And for me, I can say, wait a minute, the prayer wasn't heard, and yet this says the prayer was heard. The answer came, right? I mean, have you had that experience yet? I mean, I remember from years ago when I had to come up against, hey, there's two prayers here, and this is not, yes, this may be in Gethsemane, but it's not the prayer to take the wrath away, because he didn't take the wrath away. First Peter, says to us, he who knew no sin was made to be sin for us. So this wonderful, Isaiah 53:6. So we have this one who the cup wasn't taken away, but 3 days later, what happened? 3 days later, he's raised from the dead. And we can say in 1 Thessalonians 4:14, we believe that God raised Christ from the dead, and so we will bring with him those who have fallen what? Asleep in him. And this is what we're boasting of, chapter 3 and verse 6. If we hold on to our confidence and the courage of which we boast, we believe in the physical bodily resurrection. This is our starting point. If this point isn't valid, don't get on the train. If the starting point isn't the resurrection of Christ, don't get on the train. There's no reason to. And then we move, once we see the resurrection, then we want to know, who is this that was raised from the dead? And then we move to the deity of humanity. We move to the deity of Christ. There is a progression in our faith. So this wonderful section, do you see, to answer the question, did Jesus usurp the priesthood? And the answer is no. How do you know? 1, he was dead. How do you know he's dead? Psalm 2:7. Second, once he's raised from the dead, does Jesus qualify and the only human being that ever qualified to be a Melchizedek priest? What's the requirement? Obviously, you have to be king. He met that requirement. But second, you must be what? Live by the power of an indestructible life. I don't have the power of an indestructible life. This body gets tired, it's fatigued. My eye gets tired, my one eye gets tired. I have to quit studying. I just have to stop. I had a cold for 3 days. I couldn't even focus my brain. It's so hard sometimes when we don't have this ability to keep ourselves alive. But the Lord is faithful. So once, because of his reverent submission to death, what was the fruit?
Life.
He became the source of what? What
Life.
kind of life?
Eternal life.
Eternal
Eternal life.
Hallelujah, right? I thought some of you Baptists wake up and become Pentecostal, you know. He became the source of what? Eternal what? A salvation that has no ending. Eternal means continuous, no ending. It's the source of eternal salvation. And why is that so? Because he's high priest. We need more than a Messiah on a cross. We need one that's come out of the grave, but we need more than one out of the grave. We need one at the right hand of God the Father, whoever lives to do what? We don't realize that sin separates us from God, and that we would be separated because of our sinfulness, yet if it were not for our mediator. He doesn't wait for us to confess our sin. He's our mediator there. This child, this man, this woman belongs to me. They're mine. I'm their advocate. I'm their mediator. So there's one man between God and man, and that is the man Christ Jesus. He's our advocate. If any man sin, we have an advocate with the Father. And so he becomes eternal high priest so that he can offer a salvation with no successor in his office. He will be there. Every morning I wake up and I check the news to see if Zelensky's been killed. He's the prime minister, the president of Ukraine. You know, they got to one of his cabinet members. They blew up the helicopter. And so, so that means the security breach. The head of their internal affairs that tracks all the spies down, they got the number one and the number two man in that office. So, the Russians are after Zelensky. So, you wonder, succession, if he were to go, what would happen to the war? He's the face of Ukraine. Well, listen, if Jesus were to go out of heaven, what would happen to us? We would all perish. We only have a relationship to God because we're there as brothers of the great King. So he's our eternal source of salvation. Now, in your notes, I took the opportunity to gather some future charts because I wanted to illustrate how tough mentally the assignment was for the first readers. They're Jewish men, women, or they're proselytes to Judaic Christianity. And you have to see what they have to give up. Number one, if you change the priesthood of Aaron to Jesus, you got to give up the Levitical priesthood. That's tough. Number two, you have to give up if you change the priesthood, if you get rid of all the police, there's no one to enforce the laws. So if you get rid of the priesthood, there's no one to activate the 613 Mosaic laws. So you have to get rid of the Mosaic covenant. That's tough. 3, you got to get rid of, the tabernacle. You got rid of the temple. Give up Solomon's temple. Give up Herod's temple. The place where you meet God. You have to obsolete it. And number 4, You got to give up all the animal sacrifices, all the vegetable sacrifices. You have to abandon all of the Mosaic institutions. Now, he's going to tell you at the end of chapter 4, listen, by now you ought to be teachers, but you're stymied in your growth. Why? I'm a teacher. I can't take you any further. What's the problem? Because you have hardened your will. You have refused to go any further. You stopped learning. Look at the problem in chapter 5. The readers had stopped progressing. But I want you to please be kind to them. They have to give up everything cultic that they had, every bit of their religion. They have to abandon the priesthood, the Mosaic covenant, the sanctuary, the sacrifices, a radical transformation, just like Paul had on the road to Damascus. And now you got to have a new priesthood. You got to have a new covenant. You got to have a new sanctuary, the heavenly sanctuary. And you got to have one historical sacrifice that meets all the requirements, where he tasted death for every man. And that's the Lord Jesus Christ. So you see, I'm trying to illustrate, you see why they were stymied? Man, they've got a massive load to drop off of their back. They're burdened with all the Mosaic institution. And the church is burdened still with that law. So we have then, very important, we come into, and he says, you've stopped dead in your tracks. So when we get to chapter 6, he's going to say, we got to go on. We have this foundation, and I drew a new chart. We got this foundation. Now, what if you're building a house? I watched Sycamore build a house, and they put the foundation down on the ground. What if I came back the next year and they put a second foundation on top of the first foundation? And then if I came back the third year and they put a third foundation on top of the third foundation, and a fourth and a fifth, and they never built a first floor, you'd say, what? Well, that's kind of stupid. Well, so the question is that the writer says, we got a foundation we've laid. Now we got to go on beyond it. We don't abandon the foundation. We don't leave it behind. You build on what? Top of it. So the question is in chapter 6, and what's the foundation? And this is where you look at the weak church today. No wonder we're powerless. Chapters 1 through 5 is the foundation. And he builds on chapter 1 through 5. So when you learn the cancellation of the priesthood, chapter 7, cancellation, of the sacrifice, the cancellation of the temple worship, cancellation, it's just, you can see he's got to build on top of that, but you got to have foundation. So part of the problem in interpreting Hebrews is we got such a weak view of what a person learns and believes when they come into Christ. They have no foundation, so you can't build on it. So this is very important when we get into chapter 6. You have to know, and I think you'll like these new charts. I've had them in my mind. I finally trying to draw them out. But what a wonderful section. So they've stopped learning. So now for you and for me, this is very important. We have to guard our mind, guard our discipline. It is so easy to say, well, just bow your head and ask Jesus into your heart and you're safe. You don't need to learn. But the scriptures say what? Study to what?
Show yourself approved.
I mean, and why? Because I don't have this data in my mind. It comes hard, Jay, I just don't, it takes me hours to work. It may look like it's simple. So don't think that this stuff just automatically comes. If I say, to you, get a shovel and go out in your yard and dig a hole, the length of a casket, and how long it's going to take you. At the end of the day, you're still digging a hard earth, and you're throwing it up. It's a lot of work. Well, the same thing when you come into studying the scriptures. I may read a passage over and over and over and not understand it. And then, and ask for, for some understanding. And it may have to cook in my brain. I had to make, I don't want to admit this publicly, but I made a slight modification on one of the verses in chapter 6. Modifications, an improvement to verse 6, my interpretation. But anyway, so I'm trying to be accurate as I can, because that's one of the risks of being a teacher. So you could lead people astray. So anyway, thank you for this time. I hope this is a wonderful lesson, and we'll look at it again, and I'll bring up all the charts, and that you have them, I believe, the charts and the diagrams. But you read through this and you see, look at what Aaron was selected. Jesus was selected. Jesus didn't usurp. How do you know? Learn the use of Psalm 2:7. It's so beautiful to see what the writer did. So the writer of Hebrews interprets Psalm 2:7 just like Paul did in Acts 13:32, 34. It made it the resurrection of Christ. So it's nice to have that double interpretation of Psalm 2:7. And then you see that what is that wonderful attribute that Christ must have in his humanity to be a Melchizedek high priest? Is to have the power of an indestructible life. And that's the requirement, Psalm 110, verse 4. Thou art a priest for how long? Forever. No successor. We got a good man in office, let's keep him. Fortunately, we don't have to vote. God the Father has voted him into office, and it's for life. It's like a federal judge in America. He's in for life. Any questions, gentlemen? Sycamore, how's it going?
In First Peter 2:9,
Yeah.
it writes that you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood. So about this, of course, we are not eternal priests, but he made us
Okay.
priests, isn't it?
Okay. Yeah, Kappa.
For a short while,
Yeah.
as long as we live on this earth as believers.
Yeah. Okay. For Kappa. Number one, go and study Exodus 19.
Exodus 19.
Yeah. Background is Exodus 19. Now, in Exodus 19, God selects one nation
Yeah.
from all the nations, the people groups. He selects the Jews to be a high priest, to be mediators between the Gentiles and him. So what happens in Exodus 20 is that the Jews fail the test. In Deuteronomy 5:5, they're told to come up the mountain at the ram's horn as it blows, and they don't go up the mountain. And then in chapter 20, verse 19 and 20, when God comes down on the mountain, and the Lord Jesus and pre-incarnate, and thunder and lightning, and the people are afraid. And they say to Moses, never again let
we won't see.
never let's experience God. You be a mediator between God and man. And so there we see the Mosaic law, the 10 commandments, didn't bring man closer to God. They separated. The more commandments, the further man is from God.
Yep.
So when you see 613, you've got a massive wall between God and man. And that wall's got to be torn down so that man can come back into union with God. So so there's a failure in Israel becoming an outreach to the world, okay? Mediator. So First Peter is a descendant of these men. And so in First Peter, he becomes what? Peter is, when he's reaching out to the world, remember the early church is Jewish, they are becoming then the priest, fulfilling that promise that Israel would be that mediator between God and man. So when if you move further, you might want to push 144,000. They're Jews. They're priests. That in a sense that they're ones who proclaim they're mediated between God and man. So it is our responsibility to be ministers before, Now the problem is when you take that assignment to Peter, he's Jewish. So the question is, does the Gentile become that mediator too? That's another question. But I think part of the background when he becomes a priesthood, that's Peter is conscious of the fact that finally the descendants of Jacob are beginning to carry out their responsibility, but they ultimately fail when they abandon Jesus. I mean, the majority of them fail. Does that help?
Yes, sir. Thank you. So you mean to say we are the mediators between
Yeah,
people and God?
yeah, yeah. I mean, if when you read, I don't know about you, but I run into problems. It does not compute. I don't know how to harmonize. I see this and like your brain, this doesn't match this. And I called Alman this last week and I said, I'm working in Hebrews 6 and I know what the commentators are saying. And I said, but my mind doesn't work like that. They say that, oh, these Jewish converts, proselytes, so they had some kind of external experience and that they're trusting in those traditions. Well, that's great to say that, and that's what the commentators say, but where are you going to find that biblically? I said, my mind doesn't work that way. I want to know, what did they see between Hebrews 1 and Hebrews 6? So I'm looking for the answers in there, and it changes where you start looking for the answers. So when you run up against these things, acknowledge them. And then I put them in my little hopper that says, man, I got to do some thinking. I don't know how to solve this problem.
Thank you, sir.
Sukumar, what's happening in your world?
Yeah, there is fear in the hearts of people about the future, Christians.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there are some slight changes coming up. We are just waiting. But most of the people are frightened, in fact, about the future. But I don't think that's the right attitude. As you've mentioned about Peter, he says, don't be surprised if some persecution does not come upon you.
Strange thing happening.
Yeah. Let me, Donnie, in case you didn't know what he's talking about, 1st of January, there was a bill put before the Supreme Court of India,
Mhm.
and it's an anti-conversion bill.
I read that. Did they pass the bill?
No, they delayed vote until next month.
It is postponed to 7th February. The judgment will come 7th February, maybe.
And as you see it, if they pass the bill, then anybody will be subject to jail. Is that the way you see it?
In case you preach the gospel openly outside and try to convert people by compulsion or by some allurement, then you'll be taken to task. But if I'm worshiping inside and I'm doing whatever inside within the campus, in the church, they are not bothered. But of course, in some states, some lunatics are coming into the church and trying to stop the worship. But that is, of course, not according to the law. We have the freedom to worship. But even the Supreme Court also, stated very lightly that acceptance of any religion by any individual is individual. It is their own choice. As a major, of course, it is not for minors, but when you're a major and an independent Indian, you have every right to choose your own religion. That's what the Constitution supports. But these fellows, they try to misinterpret the Constitution and try to take the law into their own hands because the ruling party is against the Christianity. They want to push, the Hinduism upon the people by force, which they cannot succeed. I think we have to wait and see. And as the history shows us, whenever there was persecution, the church grew more in numbers. That's what happened in 1 or 2 states in India in the northeastern part. And these BJP fellows, when they, who are opposing the Christians, when they came into power, before they came into power, there was an anti-conversion bill. But when they came into power, they found out that during the years when this bill was in force, more conversions took place. Then they said, what's the use of having a bill when conversions are already going ahead? So they wisely withdrew the bill, anti-conversion bill, in a Hindu state, Hindu majority state. So I think this is all God's providential help, but Christians are not having so much faith to depend on God. They want to do something, by speaking, shouting, pulling up people to show up that we are not happy, instead of depending on God. That's what I feel. I have prepared a small sermon, Brother Bob. I divided the persecution part into three groups. The one was according to the Old Testament, and as we just now found out from the law, when you do not follow the law of Moses given by God, then you are punishable. That's what happened to the kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom, the northern kingdom, and to the Jewish kingdom, the southern kingdom. Because they did not follow the law, they were punished. All through the Old Testament, that is the same pattern which was followed. And when it comes to the New Testament, now the eternal punishment is removed because of the death of the Lord Jesus. But Paul was called with an allurement, I should say this in another way, that he has to suffer in the days to come. The very first appointment letter, the first condition is that he will preach the gospel to kings and others, but the reward will be punished. He has to suffer for Christ's kingdom. And he writes to Philippians that they were not only called to be saved through Christ, but also to suffer for him. And that's what Peter also repeated, as I said, in 1 Peter 4th chapter, 12th verse and onwards, he says, do not be so surprised when some persecution comes over you, because that is natural for us. So that is the New Testament part. So we have voluntarily come under the yoke of persecution. And then finally, in the second coming, in those 7 years of tribulation and great tribulation for our two parts, Israelites, Jewish nation is going to suffer because of their unbelief again. And that is called tribulation. But out of all these things, God is going to take us into his kingdom. And according to our 19th chapter of Revelation, our tears are going to be wiped by Jesus' own hands. And we are going to live with him forever and ever. So this is what I understand, and I'm trying to teach this to our people. Hope my English is clear to you, Donnie.
It is, Sukumar. It's better than it was in 1993.
Oh, you always talk like that.
Can you imagine? I've been seeing that smile since 1993.
July.
It's a good smile.
And then I met Kappa at the steel factory. He came out to the Sukumar set up classes. We had classes in 4 locations in their state. One of them was at the steel factory. There are 17,000 plus employees regular. So they have a church out there, and the church is used by Catholics, Lutherans, Baptists, whoever, And so we had classes there, and so that's where I met Kappa. He got contaminated. He came to my class and he got excommunicated from his church because he was living under this heretic from America. But anyway, that was a happy time. Yeah, many years ago. In India, they don't like unclean animals, and the Hindus don't. But I always saw these pigs running around out there at the steel factory. Somebody was eating pork.
Yeah.
Well, now that's really interesting because where Jennifer and I are now in Victoria, Texas, when you go out and you walk, we're staying in a little cabin at a place that people can park trailers and stuff like that. We're staying at a little cabin. And there's 80 acres of land behind us. And you go out and walk and you see the deer tracks, which are a real small split hoof track. And then there's a big split hoof track in the middle, and it's wild hogs. So you can't go out at night and walk on the 80 acres because of the wild hogs.
You might get attacked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I knew they hunted wild boar down in Texas, but yeah. Well, maybe we need to
and-
send Chuck down there with his grandsons.
Yes.
Take out some of those boars. Yeah. Well, I don't mind visiting, guys. But so we get this stored for history too. These nice little conversations. We never know. Charlie, probably none of you knew Charlie Stallsworth in Oklahoma City, but he died about 6 months